Hello, Kurt here. This is just a quick programming note that in the following episode, we'll be discussing miscarriage in a frank way. I urge you to listen, as our guest's insight and thoughts on the subject are incredibly compelling. But if it is a subject you find too difficult for whatever reason, the content is in question happens between minutes 29 and 37. Enjoy the episode.
Greetings, colleagues. Welcome to the Ivory Attic. I'm one of your hosts, Ian Isherwood.
And I'm Kurt Andreessen.
We have a very exciting show lined up for us in which we're bringing in one of our colleagues from Gettysburg College. We're bringing in Joanne Myers. Joanne is Associate Professor of English at Gettysburg College. Previously was Assistant Professor of English at Gettysburg College and a Lilly Fellow of the Arts and Humanities at Valparaiso University.
Oh, I like Lilly Fellow.
Lilly Fellow sounds pretty good. Joanne has a BA from the Honors College of Ohio University in English with a minor in Ancient Greek.
Oh, excellent. Well, so if things start going really poorly,
if you need to know the word for spear bearer, I can take care of that. Right. Yes, it comes up often.
And Joanne has a PhD from the University of Chicago, which she earned in 2005. Joanne's been widely published in journals such as 18th Century Studies, 18th Century Fiction, British Catholic History, Studies in 18th Century Culture, and Gender History. Joanne is a contributor to Gettysburg College in so many different ways, has served on a number of very important committees here at the college, as well as being a wonderful teacher who's taught a wide variety of classes, been a supporter of the first-year seminar program by teaching first-year seminars in Writing the American Dream, Immigrant Stories, the Literature of Vocation, and a first-year seminar on working. Joanne also contributes to the English department, where her locus of tenure is, by teaching courses in 17th century and 18th century British literature. Pretty widely, I would say, a wide assortment of courses in 17th and 18th century literature. And we're so happy to have Joanne here on the show.
Thank you. Before we actually hear from Joanne, can I just say, could we possibly start going towards less accomplished guests? I feel like this would be. I feel like we should start. I mean, can we get some slackers in here to make us feel better? I thought that was what this was all about.
Well, that is what it's about. But as soon as we bring somebody in and identify them right. as a slacker guest, that's going to change the dynamic of the conversation from being.
Yeah. Well, would we have to tell them? Is there an ethical thing?
I think it'll be.
Oh, okay. Anyway. Yeah. All right. Well, wonderful. Anyway, welcome, Joanne.
Hi there. I can be a slacker for the day. That's fine.
I can't imagine that, but you can work on it. We can maybe we'll get there by the end.
So, Joanne, tell us a little bit about your life before becoming an academic. I know that's a big question because you had some life before becoming an academic.
I think I can remember it.
I was going to say, do you remember it? Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, can you tell me what? I mean, I can give you like my bio.
Just a little bit of a background as to, as to your life, your story.
Sure. I mean, I have numerous hometowns. So my parents and I moved to the U.S. when I was a kid. So sometimes people kind of hear in my voice that I'm British, but I was British a long, long time ago. And I think some people assume maybe you came for graduate school or something like that, but it's not true. So I emigrated to the U.S. when I was in elementary school.
British a long, long time ago could be the name of your memoir, actually. Just for the that's a really good. Yeah.
So my dad worked for the Eastman Kodak Company. He's a chemical engineer. So we moved to Rochester, New York.
I already knew. As soon as you said that, I knew exactly
where you
had having lived in upstate New York. Yes,
exactly
I knew.
Right. So and there's many definitions of upstate. So we were upstate in Rochester. So that's one place I grew up. Before that, we lived in Birmingham, in the middle of the United Kingdom, which is not a place that many people, doesn't look like Britain.
Right. Yes.
When they think
the
of
rolling green hills. Yes.
Not so much. Yeah. The gas rings of Birmingham. Yeah.
It's not rolling green hills. It's rolling mills.
Yeah. That's exactly.
We've got all those things. So that's where I grew up. I grew up in upstate New York. I went to Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, kind of a British tutorial system in the tutorial college there, which was kind of, I didn't know what that was especially, but it was a different experience. And then because you graduate after 3 years from that program. I went and I worked in Asbury Park, New Jersey for a year.
For Bruce Springsteen.
So I used to walk by the Stone Pony
Wow.
on the Asbury Park boardwalk. But this was 20 years ago. So that was when Asbury Park was still I think it's gentrified since then. I think like every now and then we have a lot of students from New Jersey, right?
Yeah.
So when I say I lived in Asbury Park for a year, that has kind of shifted in terms
The idea of what
they're thinking of. But it was, there were a lot of. So I was not I didn't work for AmeriCorps, but it was that kind of program for the Sisters of Mercy.
Okay.
So I taught 5th and 6th grade. So you can pity the 5th and 6th graders who had me as a teacher. So I lived there for a year before going to graduate school in Chicago.
Oh wow. Okay.
What made you decide on graduate school?
Well, I knew. I think if you're an English major, I just didn't think too much about it. I don't. This is one of those things where now when I advise students, I think someone should be asking these questions. Like, why? I just sort of obediently followed the path of if you're a scholarly type person to academia and didn't think too much about it. And now sort of in retrospect, there have been moments when I wish that I had thought a little harder about what I was doing. But, I think I'm not like my father has a PhD. He's is he went to university. My mother did not. So I'm not a first generation student by any means, but at the same time, I didn't really know what I was doing. My parents had no idea about higher education in the United States. I remember when I was in high school telling them there's these things called the SATs and I have to go and take them. And they were sort of agreeable to that, but they had no idea what was going on and they didn't know. Now I teach at a liberal arts institution and I talk, in various contexts, I talk about the value of a liberal arts education. But when I was looking at higher education, did not know what a liberal arts college was. And neither did my parents. And so, it was sort of, there were a lot of choices being made there that, in retrospect, you kind of think they could have been made differently.
Well, it's funny because I was thinking the other day, at my own high school guidance counseling because I didn't know, my parents my dad went to college, my mother went to a finishing school, but they both really didn't give me much advice because I was the third of 3 boys. So my other 2 brothers went to college and they're like, well, you can figure it out. And so
I'm married to a 3rd child, so I know how that goes.
And so I went to my college guidance counselor and she's like, well, what do you think you want to do? And I said, I'm not really sure. And she said, you sound like a liberal arts college.
Off you go.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Do you remember, I don't know if you took tests when you were in, I took a test in high school.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely.
It was sort of career aptitude.
Yeah, you answered 50 questions. They could tell you exactly what you should be when you grow up.
And I got one result, and it was rare book restorer.
Wow.
And now I work very closely with, I work for one course I teach, which is the Introduction to Book History. I work with the person at the college who is the rare book restorer. And I'm like, I actually want your job. And they were right, way back, they were right.
It's amazing how those things work, right?
I think mine's an accountant.
Mine said 2 things. The highest score was a minister.
Ooh.
That obviously didn't happen. And then the second one was Army officer.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
I'm not sure. It might be.
But I think there's something in being a minister and being a teacher.
A teacher, I think so,
right?
too.
That there's some,
Yeah.
I'm the daughter-in-law of a pastor, a retired Lutheran pastor. So,
I actually really like. I'm glad to hear that the why you went to graduate school so closely mirrors my. I always tell students because they ask me, well, why did you go to graduate school? And my honest answer, and I always tell them this is a terrible reason for it, but I didn't want to get a job yet, and I was good at school, and so
I thought, being good at school.
Right.
Well, that's what I was.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, well, I can keep doing school, and then that eventually they'll give me more degrees, and I
something
don't
will
have to do it.
happen
No, exactly, no,
at
exactly.
the end of that
Something will
process,
happen.
right? Yeah, and
But
here we are.
No, and that's the whole thing. It's kind of hard to say that it didn't work. It worked generally,
It
but
worked, yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's changed now, though, right?
yeah, no,
Yeah.
exactly,
It has,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. We're not going to talk about that yet because that's too dark. That'll we're laughing now, and if we start talking about
no.
changes,
We'll go to the dark place
Yeah, that's
later.
right. That's for during drinks. Right. Excellent. Well, so that's why you kind of got into things. So what kind of things are you doing now?
Well, so sort of my whole, I think you're supposed to say like scholarly program or something like
Oh, I
that.
like
So
that. Yeah,
what
that sounds great.
what I am interested in, or what I've been interested in my whole like scholarly life so far is sort of, so I specialize in British literature from the 18th century.
Okay.
Which most people get a slightly panicky look on their face when I say that. Like they're trying to think desperately what might, like you say that, it's not an era, it's not Shakespeare, it's not the Victorians. They get better movies. They're on either side of my period. So most people are trying to think desperately of anything that was published. And they're also like, so 18th century, is that like what? Like 19? No.
Yeah,
Like the
I was going to say,
Brontes?
I always have
Yeah.
to remember that 18th century means 1700s.
1700s,
That's the one
exactly. If I could get my students to remember that, Kurt, yeah, I would be golden.
I
yeah.
may have killed Ian. I'm sorry.
No, but you always are holding up. You always use these science words that you think that make you sound really smart, and then you say, "Oh, I can't remember my centuries."
I have this kind of microscope, but I just don't know what 18th century refers to.
They should line up. I don't. I know that there was.
We're in the
time.
21st century.
I know.
Okay, so
anyway, sorry.
So this used to be called, like back in the day, it was easier because people might say, "Oh, the Age of Enlightenment" or the Age of Reason, right? But that kind of fell out of fashion in the 20th century as people kind of reconsidered the Enlightenment. And that's kind of where my research has been, is sort of the 18th century, I would say, is sort of modernity. So Shakespeare, like the period before mine, in literary history at least, maybe Ian, you can I mean, I think historians talk about the early modern period,
we do.
right? So, but I'm in modernity, right?
Okay.
Like the modern period. So this is like sometimes hard for students because they remember like that literary modernism happens in the 20th century. But I'm like, no, we're pushing it back to sort of the 17th century as sort of the dawning of modernity. So the 18th century follows after that. And sort of my work has been focused on like alternatives to the dominant narrative about what modernity means. So, for a lot of time and a lot of sort of the way that people think about this period, it was the Enlightenment. It was sort of the Age of Reason. It was the development of the scientific method in the 17th century with Bacon. And I've done a lot of work with people like Locke and George Berkeley, who was in the news this week in the New York Times for sort of his name being taken off the library at Trinity. So, I've written about those people, but I'm interested in, what else was happening in modernity and sort of the umbrella category of other ways to be modern than the sort of empirical, standard epistemological theory. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which theories of knowledge interact with theories of sociability or ethical theories. Like how theories of knowledge and the way we think about how we know things produces ways of relating to other people. And there's sort of a dominant narrative of how that happens, but I'm interested in people who were concerned that sort of the dominant narrative of modernity might lead to forms of social and therefore ethical, moral engagement that were not as substantive as they might wish. And I'm not sure if that's too specialized or not, but you can.
No, it's perfect.
No, it's great. Yeah.
Was this a conversation that was happening at the time as well?
I mean, I would say yes.
Okay,
right.
yeah,
so
yeah.
sort of yes. I think like one of the people one of the writers I've looked at and written about, Mary Astle.
Okay.
You've never heard of Mary Astle, but she was an interlocutor of Locke, whom you have heard of, right? And sort of Locke knew her, and like he knew that she was writing about him and sort of attacking his ethical theories at the time. And so there are these engagements in the time period that happened as people like Mary Astle sort of looked at Locke and said, well, yeah, you've got the state of nature, right? So Locke, kind of has this argument, and he's building on people like Hobbes and other people like him, but she said, well, that never happened. Like people have always been, and really, like men can come up with these theories. And she has this great moment where she's talking about Hobbes's theory of the state of nature, where she's like, oh, men like mushrooms just popped up out of nowhere, like they just came out of nothing. And she's like, no, people always come out of relationships. They always come out of societies. And we need to grapple with that fact, and that sort of people are not wholly autonomous agents freely contracting into society. People are born in contexts. They are always already in relationships with other people that shape the decisions they make. So she's kind of offering a different account of political theory than Locke does. And I was just, and she has further arguments about sort of ethical and moral theories.
Yeah, like how that actually,
how that plays out in terms of society. So I've always been interested in those people who are saying, modernity could be otherwise. It could be done.
It could be done
in other ways.
Yeah. That's interesting.
That's very interesting. So it's a period of great growth in the periodical press, right? So is a lot of this coming out, a lot of this debate playing out in the periodical press?
Yes, which is new, right?
Which is new,
because like as my students learn when they take classes with me, like the 18th century is the newspapers for the first time. There are, there's different forms of sociability and publicness than have ever.
This always
happens, right? Well, it happens when I'm teaching, right?
Right.
So I'm like, well, is it the lawn mowing day, or is it I taught a class because we just the class that's graduating now, the class of 2023 is the pandemic class that started in 2020,
that's right.
right? So I feel like they deserve all the nice things because they've had the hardest time. And so I hate to teach outside because you maybe can't tell on radio, but I have a tiny, tiny voice. So like
we'll make it. We'll make it.
You'll make
really,
it big, right?
Really
Which
big,
is my goal, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole reason I'm doing this. But I hate to teach outside, but I took them outside. And then there were like 3 Army helicopters circling campus the whole time because people were parachuting onto the battlefield and got stuck in the trees. I was like, well, of course, because I decided to teach outside.
Yeah, I'll file a complaint.
This would be the day.
Yeah, that they'd be parachuting. But that's a lot more distracting than squirrels or something like that.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I'm sure what you were teaching was definitely as interesting as parachuting army people getting stuck in trees.
I would like to believe, but somehow in the moment it felt like the balance of attention went elsewhere. Yeah.
So we'll get back to 18th century periodicals in just a second.
A
second. But I just wanted to bring up that yesterday I was talking about us teaching in tents back when we had tents on campus, and trying to do a hybrid class in a tent.
Cool. I never did that.
Yes,
you did.
Yeah. So I had a remote learner, but we had a microphone in the middle of the tent, and then an iPad was facing the students, and the computer was facing me. And we were in masks, and it was like 90 degrees in August. And so it was an experience. But every single class, somebody was weed whacking by the tent.
Of course they were.
Yeah. And it wasn't just out the window. It was
right next to your tent. Yes.
The grass clippings are thrown in your face.
Yeah.
It just made it so much harder.
Yeah.
So back to the periodical press in the 18th century. So you're reminding.
I'm here for that.
So one of the things that we know historians, one of the things we try to do is look for points of continuity to kind of remind people that life's always been awful. Mm-hmm. And
check.
Right. And so, oftentimes when my students are complaining about Facebook, or they're complaining about social media and the comment section and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
it's really helpful to say, no, as soon as you have mass print culture, you have a lot of people who are getting angry with each other. Right.
Right.
Oh, yes.
When they respond to each other in print.
And they're doing so in coffee houses. They're not doing it on their phones. They're doing it oftentimes in
Are we
person.
going to talk about how Alexander Pope poisoned one of his publishers?
Wait,
we can do that.
No, I would love to hear that, because I don't know this.
No, the poet sort of, this is very 18th century, like the famous poet Alexander Pope, and my students are like, who now? It also, like the 18th century, just to go back to sort of, it used to be called like the Age of Pope, the Age of Swift.
Johnson, right?
The Age of Johnson for the second half. So Pope and Swift is the first half, Age of Johnson is the second half. These are all the old monikers. No, I mean, Pope is he was one of the first authors to kind of really superintend his legacy and his public persona. And Edmund Curll, this kind of scurrilous early 18th century publisher, published some of Pope's letters without his approval, without his say-so, because this is kind of the rough and tumble world of, I think, Ian, what you're talking about, like the early public sphere. And so Pope was like, okay, I didn't want those letters published. So he arranges, I should know, but I don't remember if like Pope met Curll in a pub in London and put an emetic into his drink.
Nice.
And I'm using a fancy word here, but like it caused deep gastrointestinal distress to Edmund Curll. And then, of course, Pope publishes a pamphlet saying that Edmund Curll has died because of this incident. And Curll has to publish a follow-up pamphlet saying, I didn't actually die. I'm still alive. And, you know, my students don't really believe me when I tell them that this happened, but it is sort of like the sort of longer stage version of, you know, whatever kind of conflict people would get into on social media today. Yeah.
That's amazing. I like that. It's a good story. Well, we're trying to actually accomplish a similar type of thing with this podcast. I think we're inviting all.
I mean, not poisoning.
I'm not going to drink. I shouldn't drink.
We have the sword here just in case.
Sword, yeah,
it's
just like at the coronation this weekend. There was a sword. Right?
Yeah, this is the Chekhovian sword. It's always sitting there, and at some point during the podcast, like it will be unsheathed.
It'll be flourished. It will be flourished.
It's the Chekhovian sword.
It is.
Right?
It's good. It works really well. But yeah, so we'll get there hopefully once we get big enough.
The clock is ticking.
The clock is ticking. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Joanne, I was looking through your CV and I saw that your research has your early research was focused largely on some traditional kind of 17th century writers, but then
18th century, yeah.
18th century writers. I missed up my.
We could talk about periodization. We could talk about periodization, but then I think most listeners
you
would
can just,
be like,
you can just say 1700s.
Yeah, there you go.
People from the 1700s.
I don't think Kurt knows that the 18th century is actually from kind of 1660 to like the 1780s, 1790s.
You really.
So I'm sorry to pick on.
From the mathematician side of me, like this is really.
Well,
so
then
it's
you
true
get
that
long
I deal
and
with
short
17th century writers.
Yeah, Well, so I was being more precise than I should have. I should have thought about periodization. I think more clearly, because there are long and short centuries. By the way. That people.
I'm really. I'll sit back here and.
I remember when a colleague, a historian once told me that the 1950s start in 1945 and end in 1963, and I was like, wow, I thought it was okay when I did it with like centuries.
Well, when you were talking about modernity and that you do modern literature, I was thinking, well, I'm a modern historian, but we start in 1789.
We can arm wrestle about this later. My students are just.
The sword. The sword is about.
The sword is going to happen. Well, on the first day of class, I literally because my students are all freaked out, right? Like they're like, oh my God, it's the 1700s. So I recite the first few lines of Beowulf for them.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. Like, that is not what we're doing. We're doing modern English. Like, what way Gardner is not what I do. I do people who write in modern English, and they're like, so yeah. I mean, Kurt may know more about this, but like the triumph of my student evaluations is it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
that's the triumph.
It was actually in English, which is
Yeah, and we got to make a book.
Right. Yeah. And we got to make a book. Yes. That happened too.
So I saw your research has moved into a couple new projects that are very interesting. One that struck me is you're working on vocation or religious vocation, and then kind of, right? Roughly said. And then also looking at the cultural history of miscarriages. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about those projects.
Those projects, sure. Not coming to the college website anytime soon. When they skim through the list of faculty projects, they're like, dead babies, no. Nuns, no. So
I mean, that could be another name for your biography. If you want to
Nuns and dead babies,
yeah. But if you want to go a little darker. But.
Yeah. So, I mean, the 18th century project I'm currently working on is sort of devotional literature in the long 18th century, particularly the devotional literature that was written by English women living in religious convents, so essentially nuns on the continent between, like in the late 1600s into the 1700s, because this is another thing that people tend not to know is that, my students are always like, the Reformation happened, like it was
I know
thing.
that.
I know that.
Yeah,
It's super neat and clean, though. Just
Yeah,
happens, it's over.
yeah. My older daughter in the car the other night was like telling us, giving us a potted history of Lutheranism.
Ooh.
I was like, there's some details there that could be fleshed out. So but one thing that people tend not to know is that the practice of Catholicism was outlawed, was sort of illegal in Britain, not really, sort of in England and then Britain. After the Reformation until sort of, there are various liftings of those prescriptions in the late 18th century. But Catholic emancipation, when sort of Catholics are granted full citizenship, doesn't happen until the early 19th century.
Okay.
So if you wanted to practice Catholicism, you had to go do it somewhere else. I mean, that's not entirely true. So there are people doing it underground in England. But I'm interested in religious women who left England to join religious orders on the continent in the 17th century and the 18th century, and particularly the devotional literature they produced. And particularly because it's like when I encountered this for the first time in the archives, these are handwritten books.
Oh.
So, people are like, oh, it's 300, 400 years ago, whatever. But as an 18th century specialist, I'm like, why are you handwriting books in the 1700s?
Right.
This is
Yeah.
200 plus years after the arrival of the printing press. I found one of these books and I thought, this is just weird. I want to know more about this. And so I discovered this practice by English nuns of handwriting prayer books. And so I just got really fascinated by, there's a particular individual in a particular convent who I've been interested in, and she was the convent scribe for sort of 50 years. She had a very long tenure, and she writes these beautiful, and they're physically beautiful.
Yeah, right. You can actually
Her handwriting is beautiful, and she has hand-colored illustrations for these, and tipped them into the books or glued them into the books. And they're kind of works of art. And I just became kind of fascinated. You're talking about sort of what drives people to do their research. And I just thought, here's a point of contact with this person.
Right.
Who, 300 or 400 years ago was sort of trying to create and trying to sustain a spiritual tradition for English Catholics at a time when it was illegal. And I found one of her books that had come from France back to England, and sort of therefore there was this element of exchange in kind of cultivating that devotional culture in England itself. So that kind of opened the door to that particular project.
Was she writing in English?
So mostly, yes,
Okay.
but she's also a lot. Some of the prayers are in French because most of these women who were at convents, sort of the upper echelon of these women had learned French, and some are in Latin.
Okay.
But she was also doing translations, so you can I have looked at some of her prayer books because she made so many for women in the convent, and she's clearly translating from French and Latin into English for some sisters. So she's doing her own translations as well.
And so these were being made for fellow...
For other nuns,
Oh,
yes.
really
So they're kind of bespoke
Yeah.
prayer books. And I'm kind of one of the things I'm interested in is I don't think that this woman, this particular nun who was the scribe, had a lot of control over what she was copying or translating, but she has made these sort of individual books for
Right, she's
sisters.
put her own.
Yeah.
And they have different percentages of different quantities of material from different spiritual traditions. There's a lot of Marian prayers to Our Lady. There's Franciscan material because she's part of a Franciscan order. I'm just interested in how she puts these books together.
That's super interesting.
Yeah. Not everyone says that,
Oh.
by the way,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, we do.
Yeah, no, it's...
That's why we're here.
That's exactly right.
'cause it's
Yeah.
interesting, yeah.
And so what about your new project?
The Dead Babies?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm writing a book about sort of a cultural history of miscarriage because none exists. And it's just kind of interesting to me that that's true. That most of the books written about miscarriage are kind of explicitly therapeutic or designed to help women cope with this. And I had a miscarriage in my first pregnancy. And after a while, after the sort of the need for therapeutic reading ebbed, I just wanted to understand it more and understand the frameworks with which people have made sense of this over the centuries. And it's just, there's a need. Like, I just don't think that people think much outside of our very limited cultural framework for thinking about that kind of loss, which is really and unfortunately shaped by the culture wars over abortion.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm writing that book.
Do you think it is the kind of political sensitiveness that has historically kept us from talking about it? Because I've thought about this too, because I know, I think anyone, like we all have children. I think anyone who has kind of gone through that process has thought about this at some point. And obviously we all have friends, who've experienced it. But I think it's funny that one thing I was surprised, I will say, as I got to know more people of childbearing age, was how incredibly common it is.
Well, so there's this, this is kind of the premise of my book. There's this like sucker punch, like it's taboo, like we don't talk about it. But the first thing that people will tell you when you have a miscarriage is, it's so common.
Right.
And, I had a miscarriage late in my pregnancy. I was in my second trimester. So it's actually not common to deliver a dead baby. And, I apologize to anyone who might, I think dark black humor is one way to deal with that particular, is a coping mechanism. But, no, I think politics is one thing, but as I've written sort of half the book at this point, and misogyny is another reason, sort of just a large and widespread cultural discomfort with talking about reproduction in women's bodies. And, miscarriage is a rebuke to the attempt to know and master and understand the processes of reproduction. And I think for that reason, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah.
And then I think culturally, and we have a hard time talking about life that is liminal.
Yeah.
And so I think what was important to me after I lost my baby was saying this life mattered. It was not, my baby was never going to develop. It was never so it was important for me to understand my baby for who he was. And he was never going to be born, he was going to die. But that didn't mean that he was worthless.
Right. And
I wanted to understand that specific form of life that doesn't develop, but is meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of the books about miscarriage will frame the process of coping with it as sort of looking ahead to the future. And I wanted to offer people ways to think about the form of life that doesn't go anywhere, which actually connects beautifully back to the 18th century. Because my favorite 18th century text is a novel called Tristram Shandy.
Yeah.
Oh,
sure.
yes.
So tell me what you know about Tristram Shandy, because,
I'll be honest, I just watched the movie.
Just watched the movie, right. Michael Winterbottom. Yeah, it's a great movie. I think they did a fantastic job, because it's actually, but yeah.
Yeah, so I tried reading it a long time ago. And,
Lots of people end up kind of
stopped.
throwing it,
Yeah.
yes, putting it down.
One of many books I stopped.
Right, so I love teaching, and I teach Tristram Shandy pretty often, but it is kind of an impossible novel, and as, the spoiler I give, not the spoiler, or sort of the teaser I give to my students is it begins with the narrator narrating his own conception.
Okay.
His own slightly problematic conception, and then it takes him like 200 pages to be born. He's not born until halfway through the book, but that is a book about thinking about life outside of a developmental context.
Right.
And actually, sort of Tristram Shandy, like the book, my students are so mad by the end because it ends up being like about all his family members and not about him. And it's sort of about how your life is actually about other people in some sense. And so Tristram Shandy becomes a minor character in his own life. And so I have ended up thinking about miscarried life as sort of a minor character who, sort of from a literary critic's perspective, is a whole life, but we don't know about it. Right? It's, a minor character is someone who doesn't get to develop because they're not center stage. But theoretically, I guess they have a complete and whole and entire life. It's just not something that we ever learn about.
And an incredible impact too, right?
Yes, right. And Tristram Shandy actually starts with a miscarriage because Tristram is like, there's this whole elaborate setup in the novel in which, Tristram's life, the story unfolds as if he has this tragic life because he's born. There's a series of accidents that happens to him, not only at conception, but in childbirth and sort of shortly thereafter. And one of the facts is that he has to be born in Yorkshire because his parents have these marriage articles. Like before his conception, his parents drew up these elaborate marriage articles that said that Mrs. Shandy could go to London and have the services of a midwife. But if there was a problem with the pregnancy, like if she ended up not being pregnant, if it was a hysterical or a kind of fantastic pregnancy, that the next pregnancy she would have to deliver in Yorkshire. So she miscarries, or she has a phantom pregnancy before Tristram, which is why he's born in Yorkshire and why his nose gets broken when he's delivered with forceps and all these terrible accidents happen to him. And it's his nose that is affected by the delivery. That's all I'm going to say. It's a nose. Yeah.
See, this actually
That's
sounds
the
like
part.
a good novel, but it sounds like maybe it's harder to read than.
Yeah, it's hard to read. It was hard to read for me.
It's a very, very funny book. And, for some students, it clicks and they love it. Yeah. And then others are like, why are you making me do this?
This is good. This is perfect. This is going to be one of my summer projects.
I'm going to check in with you Karen, at the end of the summer to see how that went.
Okay.
It's a book that actually, I read it on my own. I didn't read it in a class ever in graduate school, but I read it on my own. And it's a book you have to read many times to really get, but it really benefits from reading with other people. So I love reading it with students. Okay. And I think it's best that they read it with someone.
I'll sit in on your class then.
We can both read it.
Exactly. Ooh.
We should check in on the podcast.
Actually, that could, you might have started a mini segment.
Tristram Shandy reading group.
A reading group.
Yeah. Chapter 40. There are like literally chapters where like two characters go down half a flight of staircase. And that happens.
This could be this will be our second podcast. We'll do one podcast per chapter.
I really wouldn't advise that. But yeah. Really, really wouldn't advise that. But yeah. So.
Well, shall we transition into our next segment?
Absolutely. What is that next segment, Ian?
Our next segment. What is it? It's not. Is it not? It's not what's your style. What's your style? It is no.
I'll give it to you again. What is our next segment, Ian?
Did you know? Which is our quiz. That's not a quiz.
Our quiz.
Our quiz is not a quiz.
Wonderful.
But our
this
quiz
is like oral exams.
Oh, and it's going to be so.
It actually, we have legally we actually contacted University of Chicago. We're allowed to strip you of your PhD. Actually,
yeah.
This would not surprise me about the University of Chicago. I'm currently taking an online class with the University of Chicago. Actually, every time I log in, it's like this post-traumatic thing where I'm like, oh my God, they've got me again. I'm back. It's all.
Well, that's part of the reason that I didn't ask about the University of Chicago.
Thank you.
Having known several grads.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't
Speaking of the dark times.
Yeah. That's right. So I know very little of 18th century literature. But I wanted to act like I tried. So
Modest Proposal is ironic, just so you know. So we don't actually want to eat the babies.
Oh, man, I missed that. I missed that, yeah. So when I was in graduate school, I did I was taking a nonfiction writing class, and I said to my professor, what should I read over the summer? Like, what would help develop my writing a bit more? And he said, I think you should read nothing but Samuel Johnson for an entire summer.
Ooh.
Those are beautiful sentences.
Yeah. And so I did a deep dive of The Idler and The Rambler and stuff. Yeah. And then I tackled Boswell's Life of Johnson, which was really enjoyable. And it took
A lot punchier than Johnson.
Oh my God, much punchier.
When I'm teaching Johnson, I introduce my students to the word marmoreal, which means like having the quality of marble. So his sentences are like sentences that could be carved in marble.
Yeah, they are. And Boswell represents them, I think, fairly that way too. But so I went back and I grabbed my abridged dictionary of Johnson's dictionary because I was thinking about cocktails, and I was like, what's the only 18th century cocktail I know, like real cocktail that I know? And it's Bishop, it's smoking Bishop, right? So
I was also the classic champagne cocktail from the 1800s.
Oh, right, yeah. So
I point that out because I'm always trying to get Ian to drink champagne more.
Yeah, it doesn't work well with my constitution. It's too cheerful for me. So I looked up in Johnson's dictionary how he defines bishop, and thinking that it would be an ecclesiastical definition.
There are these great...
And it's the drink.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the drink. So he gives it bishop, a cant word for a mixture of wine, oranges, and sugar.
That's a very that's a very, I mean, do you have oats? Can you look up oats in there?
Yeah, oats is a famous one.
Yeah, oats is famous. There are these handful of sort of, there's the preface to the dictionary, which is kind of fantastic, that Johnson published, where he talks about the dreams of a lexicographer. I mean, the dictionary was this huge project that, his wife died. Like, there was just all this heartbreak, and yet he produced the dictionary. But he puts in these definitions that are.
I've never heard this one.
Yeah. So oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people.
Yeah.
He's not too nice. But
I was going to say, a cheerful fellow.
He's not too nice, but then his lackey later in life is a Scot.
Yeah.
James Boswell follows him around.
Yeah, and he has these beautiful, like, journey to the Western Islands, to the Hebrides. Yeah.
Which is it's a great travel book.
That does sound like a good travel book.
Trying to get around Scotland in the 18th century.
Is there a question in here?
Yeah, so the question is...
I knew you were going to ask about the second half of the 18th century.
So I looked at, of course, because that's the only thing I know. Yeah. So who would you much rather have a glass of smoking Bishop with? Defoe, Swift, Johnson, or Jane Austen?
Well, that's difficult. That's very complex.
I knew it would be.
Yeah,
because they each offer something different. I mean, Defoe is this exuberant, amazing person who knew everything and could probably talk, as my mother would say, talk the hind leg off a donkey about anything. So he would be interesting for that reason. Swift, I mean, the answer is Swift, but I would be like terrified to be in the presence of Jonathan Swift because he was just so, any kind of pretense kind of withered in the face of, someone like Swift. But it would be Swift because he's so insightful, and I love, I love teaching anything by Swift, even though it's hard to teach Swift. Even The Modest Proposal, the one about dead babies, sort of eating babies. Do you know this?
I don't know this one.
So this is the pamphlet. It's a mock pamphlet about sort of proposing that the way to solve the problem of the Irish people and the poverty of the Irish people is to start selling babies for food.
Ooh.
And it's ironic, and yet
sure, I would hope so. Yes.
You would hope so. I mean, people didn't necessarily interpret it, and my students are like, "What the heck is going on?" But there's this moment, there's this sort of precise moment in the pamphlet where Swift pivots, or sort of the narrator pivots, and it's like, well, why not? Wouldn't this be better than what's actually going on right now? What the English are doing to the Irish right now?
It is powerfully condemning.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just love to be in the presence of Swift, but I would be terrified to be in the presence of Swift as well. And, Johnson just to sort of be in the presence of that big a personality and to see, because Johnson is a powerfully human person, sort of aware of his own limitations, and just one of those people who I think was always conscious of the gap between his gifts and his abilities. So
I wish I had that.
I wish I had less of it.
So I think, it would have just, I think, as someone who reads Johnson and teaches Johnson, I think it would be amazing to be in the presence of the actual, like the person, because whatever I think we get from Johnson is less than what he could have done. And he was very conscious of that too. And then, Austen, I want all of them. I want to be in the presence of all of them. A year ago, I taught a course on Austen for the first time. It was the first time I've taught a course just based on one author. And it was great. It was a fantastic experience. So, but I would want Austen to like me, and I'm not sure she would like me. So that would be like a moment where I was like, I'm not sure I'm worthy of this moment. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of them all at an academic conference together.
None of them is particularly well suited to.
No, Swift is definitely a question, an art question. Johnson's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah. Austen is the person sort of whispering ironic comments in your ear about the person talking. Yeah.
All right, that's actually the one I want. Just for
Defoe is at the bar, by the way, asking for a drink.
He's at the bar for a drink before his keynote. Right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Very true.
All right, I want to be Defoe talking to Austen. Can I choose that one? Well, Swift has this.
No one listening is going to care about this, so I hope you cut this out. But Swift has this amazing comment because he looked down on Defoe, and there's this mention of Defoe that Swift makes in his writing, but he refuses to name Defoe because he thinks he's so déclassé. He's like, that man who is pilloried. So they would. I don't think they would get on at a conference, but.
Yeah. This is the best quiz we've asked.
It really is. Yeah. How'd she do, Ian?
But it's the 18th century. That's why.
You won.
I'm winning the 18th century.
You won.
No one cares at all. No one cares at all. They're like, you can have it. Yeah. You can have it. But
the great thing is we care, and that's exactly why we have this podcast. So.
So you want to move to our next segment?
Absolutely. So the next segment, which is.
What's your style?
Yes, what's your style? And so, as we've talked about before, this is an open session. So we just like to talk about what are you thinking about when you? And I think let's start out with. I feel like the classroom is always an interesting one to start out with. When you're ready, you're starting your morning going to the classroom. What are the things that you're thinking about? What do you when you're approaching how you're going to go in there that day?
I mean, my clothing. My clothing. Well, I think. You talked about this with your last guest. Sort of women, I think, have this whole extra set of considerations. It's like
I don't think we fixed it the last time. So
I don't think there is a fix, and I'm not here to.
But I think
there's. I think that's the default position from which your female colleagues start. Is sort of not what I want to wear today, but what am I going to wear today that
what do other people want
that other people want that presents a suitable mix of authority and whatnot. So I think that's kind of a problem I have decided not to tackle personally. But it's interesting. 2 weeks ago, towards the end of the semester, I was teaching an essay in one class about sort of ideology and authority and sort of the ways in which we perform our identities for other people. So I went to class in jeans and a t-shirt. And I do this because the students get kind of freaked out. Like my usual sort of clothing is sort of whatever sort of professional or what, a reasonable simulacrum of professional attire.
Correct female professor.
Attire with a slight dash of whimsy. And the students were sort of freaked out by me in jeans and a t-shirt. And that was my teaching point for the day.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah.
I like that. That's a good move. I like that. Yeah.
But I do that sometimes when I'm teaching sort of performativity as a concept because it gets them to think a little about, do I still respect you when you're not performing?
Right.
But then I could say a lot more about Derrida than any of them could. So it still kind of worked. Yeah.
My students absolutely do not respect me. If a couple of times I've decided to make a choice which I consider to be a pretty okay one, which is to switch out kind of a normal waistcoat with a sweater vest, a nice sweater vest under a jacket, which my students have decided is the lowest form of wear possible. They say, why are you so dressed down today? I said, just down. I still have a jacket.
That sounds kind of
yeah.
friendly, though, like a friendly kind of teasing, because you've set the bar.
Yeah, well,
at a certain point.
I think so. I worry. I think that would be my hope, but it might just be that this is all I've got. That this is the only reason they're coming is for the presentation.
For the bow ties.
Exactly, it's for the bow tie. And
Yeah.
Well,
none of the rest of it.
Like a sweater vest, I think is very like warm and comforting, and maybe they think that's just not
It's like
you.
the granddad version.
Well, that does sound right. I'm sure they don't think that's me.
Yeah.
Warm and comfort.
You're like, you're still going to grade me, right? You're not actually my granddad, right? Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's the funny thing that I've always found, which is that, and when I first, we talked about this a little bit last time too. When I first started doing this, I thought that I would kind of maybe just kind of dress to be one of the people, one of the kids, and then the problem is at the end, you're still grading them. You're still like, the power dynamic is still there. It doesn't matter if I show up. In fact, the fact that I can show up in like sweatpants and like a undershirt that's kind of has stains on it, like it's just showing exactly how powerful I am.
That's very true. Yeah. The other thing I will say, and again, because a few years ago I started to buy all my clothes secondhand.
Oh, okay.
So that's just a choice that I make. So it's
That's
kind
nice.
of a style decision to buy, either from secondhand stores or if I'm going to treat myself from eBay.
Oh.
Excellent.
So that creates an element of what can I find to cobble together to create my professional self.
Now, could we find you like in the like bargain bin at let's say a Goodwill, like going
yes.
to like
yeah,
that
I have
bag,
no
the bag?
no
Okay,
scruples.
I
Yeah,
like
you
on
can
this,
find
yeah.
me there.
Well, I know you can find me there too.
Because I've made some great finds.
Yeah,
Thrifting. Yeah.
Thrifting is
It is nice.
is a
And
great
some
practice.
of the stuff too, like the quality of certain name brands that I'm not going to name.
Yeah, because they haven't paid us yet.
Because they haven't paid us yet. But their quality's gone down in recent decades, and
to reach back into
Right.
the
Yeah,
vintage.
right.
Yeah.
right, and the older stuff is just the fabric's better, the cut's better, like they were well crafted garments. And a lot of the mainstream brands, especially in menswear, are not necessarily that way. I'd imagine it's the same in women's wear too. But
I think even more so.
yeah,
I would guess.
yeah, because things are mass produced and pretty cheaply made.
Yeah.
And-
I was introduced to the term fast fashion. I actually didn't know this term actually until just a week ago. My student
Really?
introduced it to me.
Kurt.
I know.
he spends all his time in a lab, right?
I do spend a lot of time. I mean,
This is
his-
very ivory tower stuff.
Yeah, in his cold room.
yeah. No,
warm room,
that's
laser room.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're at the point where Shine and fast fashion brands are starting to show up in secondhand shops.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
there's, the life cycle is perpetuating itself. But yeah. But I'm there more for, Ian, what you're saying, like sort of the
Yeah.
better quality things that are older and not contributing to whatever we're doing these days.
Yeah, and making sure you just take care of your stuff too. Like the tie I'm wearing is from 1991.
Yeah,
It was bought for me by my mother.
that's nice. It's a
Yes.
nice tie.
Thank
It's a
you.
nice tie.
But
I'm not very good at taking.
I
my
haven't
clothes.
dragged it behind my
From
car. or anything
Kaufman's
like
in
that.
downtown Pittsburgh?
It's not from
or
Kaufman's. No. It was from a little shop in Swickley, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up.
I know Sewickley.
Yeah. So there was a little shop, a little men's store that they had, and kind of a little. It was an old movie theater that they converted into just a bunch of shops in the middle of on Main Street, Sewickley. It's called the Nickelodeon, named after
a great
the
name.
Nickelodeon Theater. Yeah.
That's great.
But they had a little men's shop there, and then there was another men's shop that was called Cricklewood, which also went out of business, and it's where the guys in frayed khakis would drive their ancient Mercedes up to Cricklewood and then buy like rep striped ties, and,
I like it. It's perfect.
Yeah, but yeah, Kaufman's. We used to always go to Kaufman's. That was one of the things
Yeah.
we did, especially at the holidays, because they used to decorate the front.
The
window.
windows, yeah. I mean, I lived in Chicago at the end of Marshall Field's
Oh, right, yeah.
life in Chicago. So that
so
was,
fun.
fun.
And they're all no more.
Yeah. Well, I think we've made Joanne work hard enough. Don't you think?
I think it's time for a cocktail.
I was going to say I think
It's
about
time
a
for
cocktail.
the Afro.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So,
Great.
Kurt, this is your segment of Kurt's Cocktail Corner.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break.
Okay, take
so
a
I
quick
can
break.
go. So I can go.
Get the
put some
stuff.
stuff together.
Okay.
And then we'll come back in and
All
then
right, so
we'll
take a little break right now. You're listening to Ivory Attic. Welcome back to the Ivory Attic. Hope you had a nice break. We certainly did.
We sure did. And in fact, we actually have our drink in front of us. So, Joanne, could you just tell the audience just a little bit about the request you made here?
Well,
and the name.
and the
I'd
name.
love the
Yes,
name too.
I can. So you asked for the name of a cocktail. My people are not cocktail people. The half of my family would drink a glass of sherry.
Oh, okay.
When brought to, and the other half of my family are Irish. So I never met an Irish person who would order a cocktail. But so I was
I've
a little
forced someone
strapped
to
about ideas. But I did Google 18th century cocktails, and I was thinking about the kind of things that people in the text I teach drink, and sort of punch came up. And this particular version is called milk punch.
This is?
And there's sort of this legacy that I was reading about. So Benjamin Franklin had a recipe for milk punch that he liked a lot. But this version was
Clever man, Benjamin Franklin.
I've
He did some-
heard.
did some things.
there's-
It's a hard drink to make, too.
So I thought, I didn't know, I think when I searched for this, quite the challenge that was involved. I saw the word
perfect.
curdled.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
So this drink is mentioned in the work of Aphra Behn, who's
Okay.
a 17th. I know we've gone back and forth. So she's like basically a 17th century sort of restoration, late 17th century, early 18th century writer. And she mentions this work,
Wonderful.
this drink in one of her works. And she's a playwright. She's a poet. She writes one of the first prose fictions
Oh, okay.
in English, a work called Orinoco about the slave trade in Dutch Suriname in the 17th century, which is also a sort of royalist allegory about the Stuart monarchy. But there's this moment in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Do you know? Probably may have not recently have read A Room
Not
of One's
recently.
Own, where Woolf, writing in the early 20th century, didn't have all her historical details right, but she says Aphra Behn is the first woman who wrote for money, and that all women should let flowers fall on the tomb of Aphra Behn, who was buried scandalously in the cloister of Westminster Abbey. And the summer I was 16, I was in England by myself, and my aunt took me to Westminster Abbey, and we were sort of gone through the Abbey and sort of seen all the memorials and gone through Poets' Corner, where Chaucer is buried, and we found ourselves, we just stepped out and kind of took our bearings, and I looked down and I was standing on Aphra Behn's tomb.
Wow.
And at 16, I had no idea I would go on to be an 18th century scholar who would regularly teach Aphra Behn's writing. But I have a special place in my heart, and Virginia Woolf tells me I should have a special
you
place in
should.
my heart for Aphra Behn. So,
And Virginia Woolf was big into telling people things, too.
right, so I'm going to obey.
Well, maybe when you were 16, something magical happened.
Maybe
There you
something
go.
magic, and here we are.
There you
So,
go.
and here is Milk Punch.
Do you
Aphra
remember?
Behn's.
Do you remember what the reference was? Like, what was she What was she doing with the milk? Like, was she just?
I
drinking it at a
don't know.
party? Yeah.
No, I
Drinking
think
it.
it's.
Well, I-
don't- yeah, I
thank you,
mean,
thank you.
yeah. Aphra Behn had a lot of good times in her life, I think.
Oh, wonderful.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's follow her.
Let's have some milk punch.
Let's have some milk punch.
So I want to know all about the making.
Yeah. Well, first of all, can you just describe the color there, Ian? What are you seeing?
It looks like it's kind of a yellowy color.
Yeah, kind of a yellowy color.
My favorite color.
Can I tell you?
Cheers.
This started out.
Jaundice?
Yeah, exactly. This started out with a bunch of brown liquor in it. Okay, so this actually had. Do not be deceived. This is filled with rum. So dark rum.
Dark rum. Okay.
It's filled. It's filled with dark rum. It's filled with. It has some. What else does it have in it? It has some brandy in it. I actually used some Laird's apple brandy, so this is a high proof dark apple brandy. And you notice though, there's none of that in there, and that's the milk punch of it. It's because you've milk washed the drink. And I feel like I always talk too much whenever we're doing it. So let's take a sip of it, and then I'll tell you more about it. Yeah.
Sláinte.
Sláinte. That's smooth.
That's better than I thought it would be.
The word milk does not bode well.
And curdled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so this is a really interesting one. So it's actually, when I was looking online for
It's actually pretty good.
it's really
It's
good.
very tasty.
When I was looking online for the recipes for this, I remember that I actually had Jerry Thomas's original Bartender's Guide from, this is a little later than Afroman, but it's in the 1860s basically.
Which is technically what century?
Quick quiz.
From what I've heard, it depends. It depends on who's defining
Is it the long 19th
yeah,
century? Is it the short 19th century?
It doesn't depend with that decade.
It's real fluid at that time. I've come to understand, especially in the bartending context, there was a lot of things going
sure.
on. Yeah. So,
You still haven't answered the question.
I'm not going to. I don't have to answer the quiz. But so he has a lot of interesting things to say about this. But one of the things I love is that in the recipe, so almost everyone uses his recipe. So I looked up a bunch of recipes online. Everyone basically takes his recipe and then just slightly modifies it and then calls it their own. So we're going to do the same. And so that's why we get to name it, because a bunch of other people already have as well. But so the thing that's cool is, first of all, this has an enormous number of ingredients in it. I normally don't go through all of them, but I want to talk about it. It has lemons in it, all right? Sugar. It actually calls for a pound of sugar in the original, but they were making a lot of it. But we didn't use a pound of sugar. It has a pineapple in it, all right? So fresh pineapple. It has cloves, coriander seeds, cinnamon, brandy, rum, and this stuff called a rack, which is this very pungent rum, which I do actually happen to have, and which is also in that drink. Strong green tea, and after you create all that stuff, you end up with this mixture that's kind of a brownish and has all the fruit stuff kind of floating in it. And then you do a thing called milk wash it, which is that you dump about a quart of milk into it, which immediately curdles. And so then you've created some terrible looking cocktail
Cottage cheese.
Yeah. And in his instructions, actually,
You realize some people just stopped. They've turned us off.
that's right.
now.
It's going to get worse. No. But Jerry Thomas explicitly says, he tells you about how to make this and how you have to stir it for a short time. He says, let it stand for an hour, but do not suffer anyone of delicate appetite to see the melange in its present state, as the sight
very 18th
might create a distaste for the punch when perfected.
Wow.
And so I did actually take pictures of this, but I have not shown any of you because
I know nothing.
Because
See only the beautiful
I took Jerry Thomas at heart. But yeah, it actually does some really interesting stuff. So that actually the actual milk. The proteins in the milk. Sorry, I know this wasn't supposed to be a science episode, but it always becomes a little bit of one.
A child of a chemical engineer. I'm ready for this.
But so the milk proteins actually grab up a bunch of different compounds inside of the actual drink, including all of the color compounds, which is why it actually becomes clear at the end. And so it also grabs a lot of the tannins, which is why it's very smooth. You don't get any of that kind of tanniny nature of the oaked drinks.
You know, you guys take the magic out of everything.
We put it in. We put it in. Is it?
I'm not sure I can go to my local Irish pub in Birmingham and order this, but
Yeah.
it does taste great.
It is good. It's really nice.
Very labor intensive.
It is very labor intensive. The real problem is that you really should filter with a cheesecloth, because you are basically making cheese, but in reverse. You're throwing away the cheese part,
The whey.
keeping the whey exactly. But I didn't actually have any.
Did you have the boozy whey for breakfast?
Yeah, no. That's a great idea. I should have done that. No, all I had to do filtering was coffee filters, and so it took a really long time. So I spent.
I'd like to apologize to the Wilson family.
Listen, this is what I do. I love doing this stuff. So it was purely joy. I was watching TV, and then every 20 minutes would go over and pour a little bit more in, and then watch it go a little bit further down, and then go back to the TV for a little bit. It was wonderful. And then you end up with this gorgeous product at the end.
It is very good.
So
Smooth.
So I hope it lived up.
It's
to,
beautiful,
to-
and highly colonial. I mean,
exactly.
rum, sugar,
Yeah.
all these.
Exactly. Celebrating all of the.
Yeah.
I was actually surprised, and I'm sorry. Maybe people who were more historically minded than I was surprised that pineapple was so readily available that they could make this.
Well, it's interesting because we talked about Locke. I mean, I mentioned Locke earlier. I mean, Locke talks about growing pineapples in his pinery, I think, in
Really?
the south of England in the late 1600s. And it was this exotic, amazing thing that people had just brought back from, colonial.
That's really
trips
interesting.
to the-
Yeah, I didn't know that he grew those. Or anybody in England was growing them.
It's I mean, in Northanger Abbey, in Austin's Northanger Abbey in the early 1800s, one of the characters talks about his pineries, which was the English term for the particular kind of greenhouses or sort of forcing, whatever glass enclosures they're using to grow pineapples in England at this time period.
Well, they'd have to. It's a cold, wet island.
I've been there.
Yeah.
And I
The word
know, yeah.
pinery is so good. I have to say,
good.
one of the things I love talking to you, Joanne, I think in every conversation I learn at least 3 words. I think like on average on an hour-long conversation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a low day.
Maximal
exactly.
pedantry is my goal. Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, I think that does it for us.
I think it does too. We are so grateful you came on the
Well,
Ivory
thanks
Attic.
so much
Thank
for
you so
having
much,
me.
Joanne.
Yeah, thank you.
This was wonderful.
We're going to enjoy our drink.
We are going to enjoy our drink.
Yeah. So this is the Ivory Attic. I'm Ian Escherwood.
And I'm Kurt Andreessen. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for helping us rummage through the Ivory Attic.
And we should also tell you, actually, I'm going to make you say that one more time because we forgot to tell everyone all the great ways that they can contact us.
Oh, yeah. You can contact us. You can contact us at mail.ivoryattic.com.
Mail@ivoryattic.com.
I forgot how email worked. Blame it on the milk punch.
It's very good milk punch. Yeah.
Mail@ivoryattic.com.
Do you want to try Twitter?
Yeah, you can contact us at Ivory Attic Hosts on Twitter.
Wonderful, at Ivory Attic Hosts. And then we also can contact you on Facebook.
Facebook and Instagram. We have a
you can-
Facebook page, Instagram page. You can contact us on both.
Yeah, and you can check out our webpage if you ever want to. It doesn't have that much on there, but we're getting more every day. So
Getting more
it's
every
great.
day.
And that's theivoryattic.com.
Yeah.
Well, so wonderful. So now,
Thanks for rummaging through the Ivory Attic with us. See you later.